The package weighed almost nothing in Kurt Coleman's hands, brown paper, rough against his calloused fingers, string tied in a simple knot, a small cardboard box no bigger than a loaf of bread. Outside the mess hall at Camp Hearn, Texas, the December wind cut cold across the parade ground, carrying dust and the smell of distant cattle. It was Christmas Eve, 1944. Kurt stood frozen, staring at the package like it might explode. Around him, other German prisoners shuffled forward in line, each receiving their own identical parcels from a woman in a Red Cross uniform. Her smile was patient, almost maternal. When she had placed the box in his hands, she said something in English he didn't quite catch. "Merry Christmas, maybe. God bless you." The words didn't matter. What mattered was the weight or lack of it and what it represented. Kurt's hands began to shake. He stepped out of line, moving toward the barracks wall where shadow offered some privacy. Other men were already tearing into their packages, exclamations of disbelief echoing across the yard. Someone shouted in German about chocolate. Another man held up a pair of wool socks, staring at them as if they were made of gold. Kurt couldn't open his. Not yet. His throat felt tight, his vision blurring at the edges. He sank slowly to his knees in the Texas dirt, the package still clutched against his chest. His shoulders began to shake. And then, for the first time since his capture 16 months earlier, Kurt Coleman wept. A guard watched from 20 feet away, rifle slung loose over his shoulder. He didn't approach. He'd seen this before. Christmas did things to men behind barbed wire, broke them open in ways that battle never could. Another prisoner, an older man named Friedrich, placed a hand on Kurt's shoulder but said nothing. There were no words for this. The boy was 23 years old, 5,000 miles from home, and a stranger in America had just given him a gift. 6 months earlier, Kurt Coleman had been certain he would die in captivity. That's what they'd been told. Every German soldier knew the stories, whispered through barracks and trenches, printed in pamphlets distributed by the Reich's propaganda machine. America was a land of gangsters and capitalists, a nation without honor or mercy. Captured soldiers would be tortured for information, starved in labor camps, or simply shot and buried in mass graves far from home. The Americans, they were told, respected nothing, valued nothing but money and power. They would strip you of your dignity, work you to death, and leave your bones to bleach under a foreign sun. Kurt had believed every word. He'd grown up in a small village outside Stuttgart, the son of a baker, raised on order and obedience. When the war came, he joined because everyone joined. It was duty. It was Germany. By 1943, he was a radio operator with the Africa Corps, stationed in Tunisia, maintaining communications between scattered units as the desert war collapsed around them. He remembered the heat, the flies, the taste of sand in every meal. He remembered the day the British tanks appeared on the horizon, dozens of them, an unstoppable wave of steel. His unit had no ammunition left, no fuel, no orders. They surrendered with hands raised and hearts filled with dread. The British had been efficient, almost bored. They processed thousands of prisoners in makeshift camps near the coast, soldiers sitting in the sand with nothing to do but wait and worry. Kurt had expected execution at any moment. Instead, they gave him water, biscuits, and a medical inspection. When he was loaded onto a ship bound for America weeks later, the fear intensified. This was it. They were being taken somewhere remote, somewhere no one would ever find the bodies. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. Kurt spent most of it below deck in a cargo hold converted for human transport, shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other Germans. The air was thick and stale. Men vomited from seasickness. Others prayed quietly, certain they were sailing toward their deaths. A few tried to maintain discipline, organizing the prisoners into work details for cleaning and distributing rations. But mostly, they waited in silence, each man alone with his fears. When the ship docked in New Orleans, the heat hit them like a physical blow. It was July 1943, and the Gulf Coast humidity made the African desert seem merciful by comparison. They were herded onto trains, cattle cars with slatted sides, and sent north and west across a landscape so vast it seemed impossible. Kurt pressed his face to the gaps in the wood, watching America roll past. Fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, towns with clean streets and painted houses, children waving from farmhouse porches. It didn't look like a nation at war. It looked untouched, abundant, impossibly wealthy. Camp Hearn sat in the middle of nowhere, central Texas rangeland dotted with mesquite trees and prickly pear cactus. When the train stopped and the doors opened, Kurt had steeled himself for whatever came next. Dogs, whips, shouting guards with clubs. Instead, he found rows of wooden barracks painted white, a parade ground, a mess hall, and guards who looked almost bored. An officer with a clipboard called out names in badly accented German, assigning prisoners to barracks. That first night, Kurt lay on a thin mattress in a bunk bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't a death camp. It wasn't even particularly harsh. It was just a camp. The first meal shattered him. Breakfast the next morning consisted of eggs, bacon, toast, butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute he'd drunk in Africa. Kurt stared at his tray in disbelief. There was more food in front of him than he'd eaten in a week at the front. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence, some weeping quietly into their plates. One man refused to touch his food, convinced it was poisoned, but hunger defeated suspicion. They ate, and they realized with crushing clarity that even as prisoners, they were being fed better than their families back home. The routine of camp life he fell into place quickly. Morning roll call, work assignments. Some men were sent to nearby farms or ranches, others stayed in camp for maintenance duties. Kurt was assigned to the camp library, organizing books and helping with correspondence. It was light work, almost absurdly so. The guards rarely shouted. There were no beatings. The rules were simple and enforced fairly. If you caused trouble, you were confined to barracks. If you worked, you earned credits to spend in the canteen on cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. But the psychological weight of captivity grew heavier with each passing month. Kurt missed his family with an ache that never dulled. His mother, his father, his younger sister Greta. Were they still alive? Stuttgart had been bombed repeatedly. Letters from home came irregularly, censored and often months old. When they arrived at all, they spoke of rations, air raids, and fear. His mother wrote in careful language, never complaining, always encouraging. But Kurt could read between the lines. They were starving, they were terrified. And here he sat in Texas, eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in a bed with sheets safe from bombs and bullets. The guilt was suffocating. He was alive, comfortable, even gaining weight, while his family suffered. Other prisoners felt it too. They talked about it late at night in the barracks, voices low, sharing the same crushing realization. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, though few would say it aloud. Germany was being destroyed piece by piece, city by city, and they, the captured, the defeated, were powerless to help. Christmas made it worse. As December arrived and the camp administration announced there would be holiday celebrations, the homesickness became unbearable. In Germany, Christmas was sacred. It meant family, warmth, tradition. The smell of his mother's stollen, the sound of church bells, his father reading from the Bible by candlelight. Kurt tried not to think about it, but the camp made that impossible. Decorations appeared. A tree was erected in the mess hall. American guards wished them Merry Christmas with genuine smiles, as if they'd all forgotten there was a war on. Then came the announcement that would change everything. A few days before Christmas, the camp commander gathered the prisoners in the mess hall. Through a translator, he explained that the American Red Cross had organized a gift program. Every prisoner of war in the United States, regardless of nationality, would receive a Christmas package. The items had been donated by American civilians, volunteers who had spent months collecting, assembling, and wrapping thousands of parcels. They would be distributed on Christmas Eve. The room erupted in confused murmuring. A gift from Americans? It made no sense. This had to be propaganda, some kind of psychological trick. Or maybe the packages would contain nothing, just empty boxes meant to humiliate them. Kurt didn't know what to believe. He'd been taught that Americans were cruel, that they despised their enemies. Yet everything he'd experienced in 16 months of captivity contradicted that. The food, the medical care, the relative freedom, the simple decency of most guards. None of it matched the stories. The Red Cross program wasn't charity in the sentimental sense. It was calculated, deliberate, and rooted in both international law and strategic thinking. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners of war, including access to medical care, and adequate nutrition. But America went further. The logic was coldly practical. Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems, required fewer guards, and became walking testimonies to American superiority. When the war ended, these men would return home with stories. Those stories would matter. Behind the program stood thousands of American volunteers, mostly women whose sons, husbands, and brothers were fighting overseas. They understood captivity from the other side. They knew that somewhere in Germany or Japan, an enemy civilian might be deciding whether to treat their loved one with cruelty or compassion. The Red Cross gift program was both an act of faith and a subtle message. This is how civilized nations behave. This is the difference between us and them. The packages were assembled in church basements, community centers, and Red Cross warehouses across America. Women gathered in shifts, sorting donations, packing boxes, tying them with string. Each package was nearly identical. A bar of soap, a pack of cigarettes, some hard candy, a pair of wool socks, a small book or magazine, and most importantly, a handwritten Christmas card. The cards were simple, usually just a few sentences. Wishing you peace this Christmas. May you return safely to your family. Thinking of you during this difficult time. They were signed with first names only. Mary from Kansas, Ruth from Ohio, Elizabeth from Texas. The women who wrote those cards would never meet the men who received them. They didn't know their names, their stories, or whether they were fanatics or conscripts. It didn't matter. The cards were an assertion of shared humanity, a refusal to let war erase the basic recognition that even enemies were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. For Kurt Coleman and thousands like him, those cards carried a weight far beyond their simple words. They represented something the propaganda had insisted didn't exist in America. Kindness without condition. Generosity without strings attached. The acknowledgement that a German prisoner, a man who had fought against American soldiers, was still worthy of a Christmas gift. On Christmas Eve, as Kurt stood in line watching other prisoners receive their packages, he felt the full force of that recognition building in his chest. When the Red Cross worker placed the box in his hands and smiled, something inside him cracked. He'd spent 16 months trying to remain hard, to maintain the shell of a soldier. But he was just a baker's son from Stuttgart, 5,000 miles from home, and a stranger had given him a gift on the loneliest Christmas of his life. That's why, when he stepped out of line and sank to his knees in the Texas dirt, it wasn't weakness that brought him down. It was the unbearable weight of kindness. The package sat unopened in his trembling hands, and Kurt wept not from sorrow alone, but from the sudden crushing realization that everything he'd been taught about America was a lie. The kindness that brought Kurt Coleman to his knees didn't appear from nowhere. It was engineered, organized, and executed with the same industrial precision that built Liberty ships and B-17 bombers. Behind every Christmas package distributed to German prisoners in 1944 stood an invisible army of American civilians who had turned compassion into a logistics operation that rivaled military campaigns in scope and efficiency. The American Red Cross had been preparing for this moment since 1942, when the first significant numbers of Axis prisoners began arriving on American soil. By December 1944, the organization was managing the welfare of over 400,000 enemy prisoners scattered across hundreds of camps from coast to coast. The Christmas gift program was their most ambitious humanitarian effort of the war, and it required mobilizing resources on a scale that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. In the autumn of 1944, Red Cross chapters across America issued a call for donations. The goal was staggering. Every prisoner of war held in the United States, regardless of nationality or rank, would receive a Christmas package. That meant assembling, packing, and distributing roughly 425,000 individual parcels in less than 3 months. The items needed were simple, but had to be gathered in enormous quantities: soap, cigarettes, candy, wool socks, handkerchiefs, small books, writing paper, and pencils. Each package would also include a handwritten Christmas card from an American volunteer. The response from civilians was immediate and overwhelming. In towns across the Midwest, South, and West, where most prison camps were located, women organized donation drives with the efficiency of military quartermasters. Church groups held collection Sundays. Schools gathered pennies and nickels from students. Local businesses donated goods at cost or free of charge. Tobacco companies provided cigarettes by the thousands. Textile mills sent socks. Soap manufacturers contributed bars by the pallet. Candy makers, already operating under sugar rationing, somehow found ways to contribute hard candies and chocolate bars. The volunteers who assembled these packages were predominantly women, and their motivations were complex. Many had sons, husbands, or brothers serving overseas. They understood captivity from the opposite direction. Somewhere in Germany, their loved ones might be behind barbed wire, dependent on the mercy of strangers. The Red Cross gift program operated on an implicit reciprocity. If America treated enemy prisoners with dignity, perhaps the enemy would do the same for captured Americans. It was hope wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. But not everyone agreed. The moral debate over giving Christmas gifts to enemy soldiers was fierce and public. Newspaper editorials argued both sides with passion. Critics called it absurd, even treasonous. These men had killed American soldiers. They had fought for Hitler, for fascism, for everything America opposed. Why should they receive gifts while American families sacrificed, rationed, and mourned? Why should taxpayer dollars and private donations go to make enemy soldiers comfortable? One letter to the editor of the Dallas Morning News in November 1944 captured the anger many felt. My son died on Omaha Beach facing German guns. Now you ask me to donate soap and candy to German prisoners who eat 3 meals a day while my neighbors go without butter? This is madness. Let them sit in their camps and think about what they've done. They deserve nothing from us. The counter-argument came from an unexpected coalition of military officials, religious leaders, and pragmatists who understood both law and strategy. General George Marshall himself endorsed the program, stating that humane treatment of prisoners wasn't weakness but strength. It demonstrated American values in action. It showed the world that democracy could wage total war without abandoning civilization. More importantly, it had practical benefits. Well-treated prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to attempt escape or cause disturbances, and more likely to provide useful intelligence. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established minimum standards for prisoner treatment. America was a signatory and took those obligations seriously, not just morally, but legally. The treaty required adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence or humiliation. It mandated that prisoners be allowed to send and receive mail, practice their religion, and be paid for work performed. The Christmas gift program wasn't required by the convention, but it fell squarely within its spirit. America chose to exceed the minimum standards to demonstrate that its commitment to human dignity extended even to those who had tried to kill its soldiers. Religious organizations became the most vocal defenders of the program. Ministers, priests, and rabbis preached sermons about loving one's enemies, about the Christian duty to show mercy even in war. Reverend Harold Thompson of First Methodist Church in Houston told his congregation in December 1944, "If we become as cruel as our enemies, then what are we fighting for? These men are prisoners because God willed them to lose. Now God tests us. Will we show them the light of Christian charity, or will we descend into darkness ourselves?" The scale of the operation required coordination that bordered on miraculous. In Kansas City, the Red Cross converted an entire warehouse into a packaging center. Women worked in shifts, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Long tables stretched the length of the building, assembly line fashion. One station sorted soap, another counted cigarettes, a third folded socks. At the end of the line, items were placed into small cardboard boxes, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, labeled with camp destinations, and stacked onto pallets for shipping. The women who worked these assembly lines came from every background. There were farm wives whose hands were rough from years of labor. There were society ladies who had never packed a box in their lives but showed up every Tuesday afternoon in pearls and sensible shoes. There were young women whose sweethearts were overseas, and older women whose sons would never come home. They worked side by side, mostly in silence, each lost in her own thoughts about war, sacrifice, and what mercy meant. The handwritten Christmas cards were perhaps the most remarkable aspect. Every single package included a personal card written by hand, signed with a first name and state. The Red Cross distributed blank cards to volunteers with simple instructions. Keep it brief, keep it kind, no politics, no preaching, just a human acknowledgement of shared Christmas spirit. Women sat at kitchen tables after dinner, at church socials, in library meeting rooms, writing card after card. Merry Christmas from Helen in Nebraska. Wishing you peace from Margaret in Tennessee. May God keep you safe from Dorothy in California. Some women struggled with what to write. How do you wish Merry Christmas to a man who might have killed someone you love? Others found it easier than expected. In the act of writing, the enemy became less abstract, more human. He was someone's son, too. He was far from home, too. He was probably scared, too. The cards became a kind of prayer, a hope that somewhere, somehow, kindness might matter more than hatred. By early December 1944, packages were flowing out of distribution centers by the truckload. Rail cars carried them to camps in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and dozens of other states. Camp commanders received instructions on distribution. The packages were to be given out on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Every prisoner would receive one. No exceptions. Officers and enlisted men, Nazis and conscripts, the cooperative and the defiant. The gift was universal. What made this effort even more remarkable was the context in which it occurred. December 1944 was not a moment of triumph for America. The war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge had just begun in Europe, catching Allied forces by surprise and inflicting thousands of casualties. In the Pacific, American soldiers were dying by the thousands, taking islands most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The home front was weary from 3 years of rationing, blackouts, and casualty lists. Sugar, butter, meat, and gasoline were all restricted. Families saved bacon grease and collected scrap metal. Victory gardens supplemented grocery store shortages. Yet, in the midst of this sacrifice, Americans donated items to give Christmas packages to enemy prisoners who lived in better conditions than many civilians in Allied nations. The typical package contents would have been treasures to a German family in 1944. A bar of soap, when soap in Germany was made from clay and sand, barely producing lather. A pack of cigarettes, when tobacco in Germany was so scarce it was smoked down to the last millimeter, with butts saved and re-rolled. Hard candy, when German children hadn't tasted real sugar in months. Wool socks without holes, when German civilians wrapped their feet in newspaper for warmth. The contrast was deliberate. American officials understood that these packages would be discussed in letters home. That word would spread about how even prisoners in America lived. It was psychological warfare of the subtlest kind. Every package was evidence that Germany had lost, not just militarily, but in every dimension of national power. How could a nation that couldn't feed its own people hope to outlast a nation that fed even its enemies in abundance? For the prisoners themselves, the announcement of the Christmas gift program triggered a cascade of emotions. In Camp Hearn, where Kurt Coleman waited with hundreds of others, the initial reaction was suspicion. When the camp commander first mentioned Christmas packages in mid-December, many prisoners assumed it was a joke or a trick. German propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, not generosity. Some prisoners speculated that the packages would be empty, a humiliation designed to break their spirits. Others worried the gifts would come with strings attached, that accepting them would be seen as collaboration or weakness. A few of the more hardcore Nazis in camp argued that accepting gifts from the enemy was dishonorable, that true German soldiers should refuse them. But these voices were increasingly isolated. By late 1944, most prisoners had been in American custody long enough to realize that Nazi propaganda was a tissue of lies. The America they'd been taught to fear, brutal and degenerate, didn't exist. The America they lived in was strange, uncomfortable in its casual egalitarianism, and utterly confident in its power. As Christmas Eve approached, the mood in camps across America shifted from suspicion to cautious hope. Men who hadn't allowed themselves to think about home, about family, about Christmas traditions, suddenly couldn't think of anything else. The barracks filled with quiet conversations about past Christmases, mothers baking stolen, fathers reading the nativity story, sisters decorating trees with candles and paper ornaments. The memories were painful, especially knowing what Christmas 1944 would look like in Germany. By then, every prisoner had received letters or news from home, painting a grim picture. Germany's cities were being bombed around the clock. The Eastern Front had collapsed with Soviet armies driving toward Berlin. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer. Families huddled in basements during air raids, emerging to find neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Fathers over 50 and boys under 18 were being drafted into the Volkssturm, a last desperate militia. Christmas, 1944 in Germany would be cold, dark, and hungry. And here, in Texas, in Kansas, in camps across the American heartland, German prisoners would receive gifts from strangers. The absurdity of it was almost too much to process. Men who had fought against America, who had killed American soldiers, were being treated to a Christmas that their own families couldn't have. The guilt was crushing. The gratitude was impossible to articulate, and the understanding was unavoidable. This war was over. Germany had lost to a nation so wealthy, so powerful, so confident that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. When the trucks arrived at Camp Hearn on Christmas Eve, loaded with boxes wrapped in brown paper, the prisoners gathered in the mess hall in near silence. The packages were stacked on tables at the front of the room. A Red Cross worker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile, stood ready to hand them out. The camp commander said a few words through a translator about the spirit of Christmas and the hope for peace. Then, names began to be called. One by one, prisoners walked forward, received their packages, and returned to their seats, holding the boxes like they might contain something sacred or dangerous. Kurt Coleman was among the last to be called. He watched as other men opened their gifts, saw their faces transform. Some smiled, some cried, some just stared at the contents in disbelief. When his name was finally called, Kurt rose and walked forward on legs that felt unsteady. The Red Cross worker handed him the package with that same patient smile. She said something he didn't understand, but her tone was warm. He took the box and returned to his seat, but he couldn't sit. He had to get outside, had to find air, had to be alone with whatever was about to happen. That's when he stepped into the Texas cold, moved toward the barracks wall, and felt his hands begin to shake. The package was light, so impossibly light, but the weight of what it represented, the kindness of strangers, the mercy of enemies, the acknowledgement of his humanity by a nation he'd tried to destroy, was more than Kurt Coleman could bear standing up. His knees hit the dirt, and he wept. The morning of December 24th, 1944, began like every other morning at Camp Hearn. The bugle sounded at 6 o'clock, cutting through the cold Texas darkness. Kurt Coleman swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting the wooden floor, and dressed quickly in the chill. Around him, other prisoners moved with the same mechanical efficiency, pulling on uniforms, lacing boots, preparing for another day of captivity's monotonous routine. Roll call came at 6:30. The prisoners lined up on the parade ground in neat rows, breath visible in the morning air. Guard towers stood dark against the lightening sky. An American sergeant walked the lines with a clipboard, counting heads, marking attendance. The process took 20 minutes. No one spoke. It was too cold, too early, and there was nothing to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times before. After roll call came breakfast. The mess hall smelled of coffee and frying bacon, scents that still surprised Kurt even after 16 months. The trays were loaded with scrambled eggs, toast, jam, and fruit. Men ate quietly, hunched over their plates, savoring the warmth. Some saved their bread for later, old habits from hungrier times. Others ate everything, still amazed at the abundance. Outside the windows, the sun was rising over empty fields, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Work assignments were posted after breakfast. Some men were detailed to maintenance crews, repairing fences or painting barracks. Others were loaded onto trucks for farm labor, though most agricultural work had slowed with winter. Kurt was assigned to the camp library, his usual posting. He would spend the day organizing books, processing loan requests, and helping prisoners write letters home. It was indoor work, warm and quiet, the kind of assignment men competed for. But this morning felt different. There was a tension in the air, a collective awareness that today was not just another day. It was Christmas Eve. In Germany, families would be gathering, or trying to, in whatever remained of their homes. Here, behind barbed wire in Texas, the prisoners faced a holiday that emphasized everything they had lost: home, family, freedom, hope. At 10 o'clock, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. All prisoners were ordered to report to the mess hall at 2 o'clock that afternoon. No explanation was given. The announcement triggered immediate speculation. Some feared it was bad news, perhaps word of German defeats on the Eastern Front. Others wondered if it was some kind of Christmas service. A few optimists suggested it might be extra rations or a special meal. No one guessed the truth. The hours between morning and afternoon crawled past with excruciating slowness. Kurt tried to focus on his library work, but his mind wandered. He thought about his family in Stuttgart. Were they alive? His last letter from home had arrived 6 weeks earlier, dated late October. His mother had written in her careful script about the cold weather arriving early, about how they missed him, about how they prayed for his safety. She hadn't mentioned the bombing, but Stuttgart had been hit hard throughout 1944. Kurt knew what she wasn't saying. At 1:30, prisoners began drifting toward the mess hall. By 2 o'clock, nearly 800 men had crowded inside, standing shoulder to shoulder, filling the space with nervous energy. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison, stood at the front with his translator and several guards. Next to him stood a woman Kurt didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing the distinctive uniform of the American Red Cross. Colonel Harrison spoke first, his voice carrying across the hall. The translator, a German-American corporal from Milwaukee, rendered his words into precise German. "Gentlemen, today is Christmas Eve. I know many of you are far from home and thinking of your families. The American Red Cross has organized a special program for all prisoners of war held in the United States. Today, each of you will receive a Christmas package donated by American civilians and prepared by Red Cross volunteers." The room erupted in confused murmuring. Prisoners turned to each other, questioning whether they'd heard correctly. A Christmas package from Americans? The skepticism was immediate and vocal. Some prisoners shouted questions. Was this propaganda? What was the catch? Others simply stared in disbelief, unable to process what they'd just heard. Colonel Harrison raised his hand for silence. "These packages contain small gifts: soap, cigarettes, candy, and other items. There are no conditions attached. You don't have to do anything to receive them. They are given freely in the spirit of Christmas. When your name is called, please come forward." The translator finished, and silence fell over the hall. The prisoners looked at each other, at the guards, at the Red Cross worker who stood beside a stack of brown paper packages piled on several tables. She was smiling, but not in a way that felt threatening. It was a sad smile, Kurt thought, the smile of someone who understood loss. The first name was called: Heinrich Becker. A young soldier from Bavaria walked forward slowly, as if expecting a trap. The Red Cross worker handed him a package, said something in English, and smiled again. Heinrich took the box carefully, holding it like it might bite. He returned to his place in the crowd and just stood there, staring at it. More names followed. One by one, prisoners walked forward and received their packages. The initial suspicion began to give way to curiosity, then to something more complex. Kurt watched as men returned to the crowd holding their boxes with expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained emotion. Some immediately began tearing open the wrapping. Others held the packages carefully, reverently, unable to bring themselves to open them yet. Werner Schmidt, an older prisoner who had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, opened his package first. His hands shook as he unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small cardboard box. He lifted the lid slowly, and Kurt saw his face transform. Werner pulled out a bar of soap and held it to his nose, inhaling deeply. Then came a pack of cigarettes, some hard candies wrapped in colored paper, and a pair of thick wool socks. Werner's eyes filled with tears. He clutched the socks against his chest and turned away, shoulders shaking. Near the front, a prisoner named Josef opened his package and immediately began to laugh. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes when emotion has nowhere else to go. He held up a small chocolate bar, waving it like a trophy, and shouted, "They gave us chocolate. The Americans gave us chocolate." Others around him started laughing too, a release of tension that had been building since the announcement. But not everyone laughed. Franz Müller, a corporal from Berlin, opened his package and went completely still. He pulled out a handwritten Christmas card and read it silently. His lips moved, forming the English words he didn't quite understand. Then he sat down on the floor where he stood, card still in hand, and stared at nothing. Someone asked if he was all right. Franz didn't respond. He just sat there, holding the card, lost in some private grief. The names continued. Klaus Zimmermann, Peter Hoffmann, Friedrich Weiss. Each man walked forward, received his package, returned to the crowd. The pile of wrapped boxes on the tables gradually diminished. The mood in the hall shifted as more packages were opened. The initial shock gave way to a collective emotion that Kurt couldn't quite name. It was gratitude mixed with guilt, wonder mixed with sorrow, a recognition of kindness that made their captivity somehow harder to bear. Finally, Kurt heard his own name. Kurt Coleman. His heart jumped. He pushed through the crowd toward the front, aware of hundreds of eyes watching, though everyone was too absorbed in their own packages to really notice him. The Red Cross worker handed him his package with both hands, a small gesture that felt ceremonial. She looked directly at him and said something in English. Her tone was warm, gentle. Kurt nodded, not understanding the words but recognizing the sentiment. He took the package and turned away. He couldn't stay in the hall. The press of bodies, the smell of cigarette smoke already being lit, the sounds of grown men crying, it was too much. Kurt pushed toward the door and stepped outside into the cold December air. The sun was lower now, afternoon light slanting across the parade ground. He walked quickly toward the barracks wall, seeking shadow, seeking privacy for whatever was about to happen. The package felt impossibly light in his hands. Brown. Paper, slightly rough, string tied in a simple bow, his name written in careful black letters on a white label. Someone had written his name. An American, somewhere, had written Kurt Coleman and attached it to this package. The thought made his throat tight. He pulled at the string with trembling fingers. The bow came undone easily. He folded back the brown paper, revealing a plain cardboard box underneath. He lifted the lid. Inside, nested carefully, were the contents of his Christmas gift. A bar of white soap, still wrapped in paper printed with flowers. A pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, several pieces of hard candy in bright wrappers, a pair of thick wool socks, dark green, hand-knitted with careful stitches. And underneath everything, a white card with a red border. Kurt set the box down on the ground and picked up the card with both hands. The front showed a simple drawing of a Christmas tree. He opened it. Inside, written in blue ink in neat cursive handwriting, was a message in English. Kurt's English was limited, learned mostly from guards and library books, but he could make out the words. Merry Christmas. May God keep you safe and bring you home to your family. You are not forgotten. With Christian love, Eleanor Mitchell, Topeka, Kansas. Kurt read it 3 times, then a 4th. The words blurred as his eyes filled with tears. Eleanor Mitchell, Topeka, Kansas. A woman he would never meet had written him a Christmas card. She had thought about him, or someone like him, a German prisoner, far from home. She had wished him safety. She had told him he was not forgotten. The dam broke. Kurt's knees buckled and he sank to the dirt, card still clutched in his hands. The tears came hard and fast, his body shaking with sobs he couldn't control. All the grief he'd held back for 16 months, all the fear and guilt and homesickness came pouring out. He wept for his family in Stuttgart, probably huddled in a basement while bombers flew overhead. He wept for the Christmases of his childhood, safe and warm and whole. He wept for the young man he'd been before the war, the baker's son who'd never imagined kneeling in Texas dirt, broken by kindness. He wasn't alone. Through his tears, Kurt could hear others. Men were emerging from the mess hall, packages in hand, and the sounds of weeping echoed across the camp. Some men sat on the barrack steps, heads in hands. Others walked in circles, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. A few stood at the fence line, staring out at the empty Texas landscape as if they could see all the way home. Friedrich Weiss, the older prisoner who had touched Kurt's shoulder earlier, came and sat down beside him in the dirt. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, his own package opened beside him, his own card gripped in weathered hands. After a moment, he began to speak quietly, almost to himself. "My son is 19. He's somewhere on the Eastern Front. I don't know if he's alive. And here I am, being given gifts by the people we fought against. What kind of world is this?" Kurt couldn't answer. There was no answer. The guards watched from their posts but didn't interfere. They'd been briefed on what to expect, told that Christmas might provoke strong reactions. One young guard, barely 20 himself, stood near the mess hall with his rifle hanging loose, staring at the ground, clearly uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. Inside the mess hall, the distribution continued. More names called, more packages handed out, more men walking out into the cold afternoon clutching their gifts like lifelines. The Red Cross worker, Eleanor Mitchell's counterpart in this strange exchange of humanity across enemy lines, continued to smile and hand out packages, her eyes bright with tears she tried to hide. As the afternoon wore into evening, the initial shock began to settle into something deeper. Men gathered in small groups, sharing the contents of their packages, reading each other's Christmas cards, trying to puzzle out the English words. Some cards were simple, just a sentence or two. Others were longer, more personal. One prisoner's card mentioned that the writer's son was serving in the Navy in the Pacific. She wrote that she prayed for all mothers' sons on both sides to come home safely. That night, Christmas Eve, 1944, the barracks at Camp Hearn were quieter than usual. Men lay in their bunks, wool socks warming their feet, chocolate melting slowly in their mouths, cigarettes glowing in the darkness. The handwritten cards were tucked under pillows or folded carefully into pockets. Some men would carry them all the way back to Germany, keeping them for decades as proof that once, in the darkest time, a stranger had shown them mercy. Kurt Coleman lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling, Eleanor Mitchell's card resting on his chest. He thought about her in Topeka, Kansas, wherever that was. He imagined her sitting at a kitchen table, writing card after card, thinking about German prisoners she would never meet. Her son was fighting somewhere, maybe in Europe, maybe against Germans like Kurt. Yet she had taken the time to wish him safety, to tell him he was not forgotten. The weight of that gift, not the soap or cigarettes or socks, but the recognition of his humanity, settled over Kurt like a blanket. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than fear or guilt or homesickness. He felt seen. He felt acknowledged. He felt, despite everything, human. Outside, the Texas night was cold and clear. Stars stretched across the sky, the same stars that shone over Stuttgart, over Kansas, over battlefields and prison camps and homes where families gathered or grieved. Christmas Eve, 1944. A package wrapped in brown paper, a card written by a stranger's hand. And in the dirt of a prison camp, a young man on his knees, learning that even in war, even across enemy lines, mercy could still find a way through. The stars above Camp Hearn, that Christmas Eve, witnessed something the architects of war had never planned for. Across the barracks in the quiet darkness after lights out, German prisoners lay awake holding handwritten cards from American strangers, and the carefully constructed walls of propaganda began to crumble. Kurt Coleman was not the only man whose worldview shifted that night. He was simply one of thousands experiencing the same revelation, the same cognitive dissonance between what they'd been taught and what they'd received. The morning after Christmas, Kurt woke with Eleanor Mitchell's card still tucked in his shirt pocket. The wool socks she'd included were on his feet, warmer than anything he'd worn in months. At breakfast, the mood among the prisoners was subdued but different. Men who usually ate in silence now spoke in low tones, sharing what their cards had said, comparing the small gifts, trying to articulate feelings they didn't fully understand. Friedrich Weiss sat across from Kurt, methodically spreading jam on toast. "I've been thinking all night," he said quietly. About the woman who wrote my card. She said her husband died at Normandy, an American soldier killed by Germans, and still she wrote to wish me Merry Christmas. He paused, staring at his plate. I don't know what to do with that information. Kurt nodded. He understood perfectly. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How do you reconcile being shown kindness by people whose loved ones you may have killed? How do you accept a gift from those you were trained to see as subhuman? The only honest answer was to acknowledge that everything they'd been taught was a lie, and that acknowledgement required dismantling an entire worldview. Over the following days and weeks, conversations in the camp shifted. The hardcore Nazis, those who still clung to the ideology even in captivity, found themselves increasingly isolated. Most prisoners had already suspected the war was lost, but the Christmas gifts provided something more profound than military intelligence. They provided moral clarity. A nation capable of such generosity, even toward enemies, was not the degenerate society Nazi propaganda had described. If America was this wrong about this, what else had the Reich lied about? The letters written home in January 1945 reflected this transformation, though camp censors ensured nothing too explicit made it through. Kurt wrote to his mother, carefully choosing words that wouldn't be redacted. We were given gifts for Christmas by American volunteers. I received warm socks and a kind note. The people here are not what we were told. I am treated fairly. I am fed well. I hope you are safe. I think of you constantly. His mother's response arrived in March, her handwriting shakier than before. I am grateful you are safe, even so far away. Stuttgart is not what you remember. We have little food. The bombings continue. Your sister Greta has been evacuated to the countryside. Your father's bakery is gone, destroyed in November. When this war ends, I do not know what we will return to, but knowing you are alive gives me strength. The contrast haunted Kurt. His family was starving while he gained weight. His father's life's work was rubble while he organized library books in a heated building. The guilt was crushing, but it came with a clarity he couldn't deny. Germany had gambled everything on a war it could never win against a nation with resources so vast it could afford compassion. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The announcement came over the camp loudspeaker just after morning roll call. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich was finished. In the mess hall, prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some wept openly. Others sat motionless, processing the end of everything they'd known. A few of the remaining Nazi loyalists refused to believe it, insisting it was Allied propaganda. But most knew it was true. They'd known for months. Repatriation began slowly. Processing 400,000 prisoners took time, and those considered low risk were prioritized. Kurt remained at Camp Hearn through the summer and fall of 1945, working in the library, waiting for his name to appear on transport lists. During those months, he read everything he could find about Germany's defeat, about the camps that had been discovered, about the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Each revelation was another stone in the wall separating him from the ideology he'd once believed. In November 1945, Kurt was finally transported to a processing center in New Jersey, then loaded onto a Liberty ship bound for Bremerhaven. The crossing took 12 days. Below deck, hundreds of former prisoners made the journey in silence, each contemplating what awaited them. When the ship docked in December, 2 years almost to the day after Kurt had received his Christmas package, he stepped onto German soil and barely recognized it. Bremerhaven was rubble. The port facilities were partially rebuilt by Allied engineers, but the city beyond was devastated. Hollow buildings, streets cleared of debris but empty of life, people moving like ghosts through ruins. Kurt was processed through a British-run facility, given travel documents and a small amount of occupation currency, and released. He had no idea if his family was even alive. The journey to Stuttgart took 3 days by a combination of military transport and walking. The trains ran sporadically, often delayed or rerouted around destroyed infrastructure. Every city Kurt passed through told the same story. Cologne was flattened, Frankfurt was rubble. The German countryside was filled with refugees, displaced persons, former soldiers, all wandering through the wreckage of the Reich. When Kurt finally reached Stuttgart in mid-December 1945, he found his childhood neighborhood erased. The street where his father's bakery had stood was gone, replaced by collapsed buildings and cleared rubble. He asked everyone he met about his family, showing them a photo he'd carried through the war. An old woman finally recognized his mother's face. She's alive. She and Greta are living in the basement of the old church on Hauptstrasse. Your father died in an air raid last spring. Kurt found them in a church basement converted into housing for dozens of families. His mother had aged 20 years in the 3 he'd been gone. She weighed perhaps 40 kilograms, her face gaunt, her hands skeletal. Greta, his little sister, was 16 now, thin and quiet, her eyes holding horrors Kurt didn't want to imagine. They wept when they saw him, clinging to each other in the cold basement, while around them other displaced families tried to provide privacy for their reunion. The Germany Kurt returned to bore no resemblance to the nation he'd left. The proud Reich was reduced to occupied zones, administered by foreign powers, its people surviving on rations that made prison camp meals seem lavish. His mother told him about the final years, the bombings, the fear, the starvation, his father's death when the bakery took a direct hit, Greta's evacuation to a farm where she'd been worked like a slave, the Soviet advance and the terror it brought, the final collapse and the strange relief of surrender. Kurt stayed in Stuttgart for 3 years, helping rebuild, working construction jobs for the American occupation forces, earning enough to keep his mother and sister fed. He watched Germany transform under Allied administration, saw the Marshall Plan pour resources into reconstruction, witnessed former enemies becoming partners in recovery. The contrast with Soviet-occupied East Germany was stark and instructive. But Kurt couldn't shake the memory of Texas. At night, he would take out Eleanor Mitchell's Christmas card, now worn and faded, and read it by candlelight. "You are not forgotten." Those words had sustained him through the war's end and through the grim reality of post-war Germany. He began to wonder about her, about Topeka, Kansas, about whether she was still alive, whether her son had survived. In 1948, Kurt made a decision that shocked his mother but didn't surprise her. He applied to immigrate to the United States. The process was complex, requiring sponsorship and documentation, but former POWs who had clean records and useful skills were eligible. Kurt's English, learned in the camp library, and his experience working for the occupation forces made him a strong candidate. In March 1949, he received approval. The ship that carried Kurt to America in April 1949 was filled with displaced persons, refugees, and immigrants seeking new lives. When he saw the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, Kurt wept. He was returning to the nation that had held him, prisoner, but this time as a free man, choosing captivity's opposite, freedom. He settled in St. Louis, Missouri, finding work in a bakery, eventually saving enough to open his own small shop. He married a German immigrant woman named Helga in 1952. They had 2 children, both born American citizens. Kurt became a citizen himself in 1955, swearing an oath to the Constitution with his hand over his heart, meaning every word. But Eleanor Mitchell's card remained in his wallet, carried every day for decades. He tried several times over the years to locate her, writing letters to the Red Cross, to churches in Topeka, to veteran organizations. The trail was always cold. Too many years had passed. Too many people had moved or died. He began to accept that he would never find her, never get to say thank you for the gift that had changed his life. Then, in 1983, a miracle occurred. A local newspaper in St. Louis ran a human interest story about former German POWs who had settled in America. Kurt was interviewed, and he mentioned the Christmas package, the card from Eleanor Mitchell in Topeka, Kansas. He still had it, he told the reporter, still carried it after 38 years. The story was picked up by wire services. Within a week, Kurt received a phone call. A woman's voice, elderly but strong, said, "Mr. Coleman, this is Eleanor Mitchell. I heard you've been looking for me." Kurt could barely speak. Eleanor explained that her son had survived the war, returned home, and given her grandchildren. She had volunteered with the Red Cross for years after the war, writing hundreds of Christmas cards to prisoners, never knowing what became of any of them. She was now 79 years old, widowed, living with her daughter in Kansas City. She would very much like to meet him. They met a month later at Kurt's Bakery in St. Louis. Eleanor arrived with her son, a gray-haired veteran named Robert, who walked with a limp from wounds received in France. The meeting was emotional, awkward, and profound. Kurt showed her the card, preserved now in a protective sleeve. Eleanor held it with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "I wrote so many of these," she whispered. "I never knew if they mattered, if anyone even read them." Kurt took her hands in his. "Mrs. Mitchell, you saved my life, not from death but from hatred. You showed me that humanity could survive war. Everything I built in America, I built because you helped me believe America was worth coming back to." The meeting was covered by local news. The story of a German prisoner and the American woman whose Christmas card had changed his life resonated across the country. Other former POWs reached out, sharing similar stories. A veteran in Ohio who had kept his Red Cross card for 40 years. A man in California who still had the wool socks he'd received at Christmas 1944, never worn, preserved as a reminder of unexpected mercy. The broader impact of the Red Cross Christmas program became clear through historical research in subsequent decades. Studies showed that German POWs held in America returned home with overwhelmingly positive views of American society. In surveys conducted in the 1950s and 60s, former prisoners reported that their treatment in captivity had influenced their perspectives on democracy, their willingness to support American policy during the Cold War, and their descriptions of America to their children. The numbers told a compelling story. Of the approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners held in America during World War II, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Cooperation was high, violence was rare, and post-war testimonials were overwhelmingly positive. Compare this to prisoners held in Soviet camps, where mortality rates exceeded 50%, and survivors returned home broken and bitter. The psychological warfare of compassion proved more effective than any propaganda campaign could have been. Every German POW who returned home became a witness to American power, not just military, but moral. They had seen with their own eyes a nation so wealthy it could feed its enemies, so confident it didn't need to crush them, so secure in its values it could afford generosity even during total war. Werner Schmidt, the schoolteacher from Hamburg who had wept over his Christmas package at Camp Herne, wrote in his memoir published in 1968, "The Nazis taught us that mercy was weakness, that compassion was for the inferior. Then American women, whose sons were dying at German hands, sent us Christmas gifts. That single act did more to destroy Nazi ideology in my mind than any battle ever could." The mathematics of mercy were coldly pragmatic. The cost of the Christmas program was minimal, roughly $2 per package, totaling less than $1 million for the entire operation. Compare this to the value of post-war German cooperation during Reconstruction and the Cold War. Former POWs became advocates for democracy, business partners, cultural ambassadors. Many, like Kurt, immigrated and became productive American citizens. The return on investment was incalculable. In interviews conducted late in life, Kurt Coleman spoke often about that Christmas Eve in 1944. "I was on my knees in the dirt," he would say, "not from despair, but from the weight of being seen as human by those who had every right to hate me. That moment taught me something I try to live by. Kindness is not weakness. Generosity is not surrender. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it." Kurt passed away in 2006 at the age of 85. At his funeral, his children displayed Eleanor Mitchell's Christmas card in a frame beside his casket. Eleanor had died in 1994, but her son Robert attended the service, bringing with him a box of letters Kurt and Eleanor had exchanged over their 11 years of friendship. The two families, once separated by war, had become connected by a gift wrapped in brown paper. The legacy of that Christmas extends beyond individual stories. It speaks to something fundamental about how wars are won and what victory means. America defeated Germany militarily, economically, and ideologically. But perhaps the most complete victory came not from bombers or tanks, but from thousands of women sitting at kitchen tables, writing Christmas cards to enemy prisoners, proving through the smallest gestures that their way of life was worth defending. In the coldest winter of the war, when darkness seemed absolute and hatred felt justified, a stranger in Kansas took the time to tell a German prisoner he was not forgotten. That single act of mercy rippled across decades, across an ocean, across the divide between enemy and friend. It brought a young man to his knees, brought him back to America years later, and ultimately brought two families together in a friendship that outlasted the war that had tried to make such friendship impossible. The package weighed almost nothing, but its contents, a bar of soap, some candy, wool socks, and a handwritten card, carried the weight of a truth more powerful than any weapon. That even in war, even across enemy lines, humanity can find a way through. That kindness, freely given without condition or expectation, can change hearts more effectively than force ever could. That the mathematics of mercy, calculated not in dollars but in dignity, can turn enemies into witnesses, witnesses into immigrants, and immigrants into friends. Kurt Coleman died an American citizen, a small business owner, a father and grandfather, carrying in his wallet a faded Christmas card from a woman he'd met only once but never forgot. The card's simple message, written in blue ink 70 years ago, had proven more durable than empires, more powerful than propaganda, more true than any promise made by those who believed cruelty was strength. You are not forgotten. In remembering, we honor not just Kurt and Eleanor, but all those who chose mercy when vengeance was easier, who chose kindness when hatred was justified, who chose to see the human in the enemy. Their legacy is the world they helped build from the ruins of the one they survived, a world where former enemies became friends, where compassion proved stronger than conquest, and where a simple gift given freely on Christmas Eve changed everything.